Hi, I'm Russ Brialt with the Shroud of Education Project, and welcome to the Shroud Report. Today our guest is Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia. And Kim, you are the Executive Director of the Atlanta Center for the Continuing Study of the Shroud of Turin.
That's correct, Russ. Glad to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, you've been studying the Shroud for 20-plus years, and now your particular area of interest has been in the area of the historical.
Well, trying to establish where the Shroud was for the first 600 years. That seems to be important, and then we can move on from there. Beyond that, we have a pretty good idea of its history.
Now, for the first 600 years, there are clues and legends and folklore and kind of references to it, and some are hidden, and you've been just studying for years on trying to find some of these perhaps more obscure historical references to the existence of this image of this shroud.
Now, for want of a better term, I've called them spy clues, and each one in and of itself may not be significant, but when you put them all together, they have a sort of synergistic effect. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Right. Now, what is the story behind the shroud? If the shroud is the shroud of Christ, then obviously it started in Israel in the first century sometime, and why don't you kind of take us from the first century and move us forward?
Well, yes, there's been a debate, of course, whether it was a forgery in Europe or it began in the Palestine. And I think in 1998 at Turin, probably the most revelatory lecture given there was by Avinoam Danin, a botanist from Jerusalem, Israel's lead botanist, and he pointed to three pollen on the shroud. One of them, zygophyllum, exists only from the Sinai to Jericho and slightly across the river into Jordan. Then we have, beyond that, we have Pistacia, and then we have Gundelia dumosum, which is the crown of thorns. It's the most prevalent one. Danin is also able to tell that these flowers and plants were blooming in March and April, the same time as Passover or the Christian Easter. So he says, I have no idea whose image is on the shroud, and I am not competent to say. But what I can say is its origins are in the Palestine and not in Europe. Well, we go on from there. According to legend, following that Easter morning when nothing was left in the tomb where Jesus was buried, except the shroud and other linen cloths, some of the legends say that James, the brother of Jesus, or the first bishop of Jerusalem, was entrusted to give it to Thomas, who gave it to Addai, which is Syriac for St. Jude, who then took it to a town in southeastern Turkey, then known as Edessa, today known as Urfa.
How far would that be from Jerusalem?
There was debate. Originally we thought it was very early, maybe as early as 70 A.D. I think a more accurate date, Ian Wilson, the historian, has revised it and figures it may have gotten into Edessa around 112.
But in terms of mileage, it's about 100 miles, 150 miles from Jerusalem? Or is it more than that?
Maybe a little more than that.
Okay, all right.
It goes up there, the king converts, he's healed of leprosy, and that's where Jude gets the term, the patron or the saint of lost or hopeless causes.
Okay. Now, who's the patron saint of the city of Edessa?
Well, Jude and Thomas, who according to legend, remember Thomas went to India, and his bones are translated back from India, and together both sets of bones are put in the cathedral, Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, in Edessa. And these are the patron saints of Edessa, Addai and Thomas, and in fact there is a whole theological school of Thomas that grows up and around Edessa. So we have that.
And interesting, the relationship of doubting Thomas.
Yes.
And I'm probably getting ahead of you, but okay.
Well, that's true. And interesting in the passage about Thomas, where the only thing that story appears only in the Gospel of John, and it is he who notices the wound in the side, whereas the other Gospels besides John talk about the hands and the feet. Somebody had to notice the side wound, and that will become important later on in the Shroud, 944, when it's transferred to Edessa, and the night it arrives, Gregory the Referendarius notices not only the face, but he says he notices the blood and water from the wound in the side.
And this is when it moves from Edessa to Constantinople?
No, from 944. But we want to go back earlier than
right.
that and try and find out what happens. The Shroud is rediscovered. Well, I should maybe lead up to that. The king who was healed of leprosy, by the time he has a grandson coming along, he says, the heck with Christianity. He reverts to paganism.
Now this is
in the city of Edessa.
This is what we call the legend of King Abgar.
King Abgar is correct. And eventually the Shroud is walled up in the west wall, in a niche in the west wall, where it remains until there's a flood in 525 A.D. At that time, the Emperor Justin sends down engineers to divert the river Dason. In the course of the repairs and diversion of the river, the Shroud is rediscovered in a niche above that west wall and is known once again. What becomes interesting here now, in the 6th century, is that by 550, an icon is painted and given by the emperor to the monastery of St. Catherine down in the Sinai Desert. It is an encaustic icon, meaning that it is painted out of hot waxes rather than paint. And now we know through work done by Dr. Alan Wanger at Duke University that there are about 250 points of congruence, similarity between this painting and the face and the Shroud. As we need only 40 to 60 to get a conviction in a court of law today, it's pretty convincing that the artist who did that portrait...
So now I think we have an image of it right here.
Yes, there it is, and amazing for the fact that it was done in 550 A.D. Still with us today. It escaped the iconoclastic controversy when many relics were destroyed because it was so far away from the coast of Egypt down on that Sinai Peninsula that nobody wanted to drive a camel or a horse that many days in the hot sun. They said, let them keep them. We are not going down there to destroy them. So it's with us today. The same emperor, the western extent of the Byzantine Empire at that time, was in Ravenna on the eastern coast of Italy, south of Venice. And if we go there to San Apollinare Nuovo, a church there, in the clear story, we have two sets of mosaics, one done prior to 550.
I think we have an image of that right here.
All right. And here you go. Here is the Apollo-like, beardless Christ, the way he was most often portrayed before the Shroud was rediscovered. But amazingly enough, in the same church, on the other side of the clear story, when you look up, after the Shroud is discovered, we find what is the traditional Shroud face today. One nostril larger than the other, the huge eyes, the little flecks of hair up on the forehead. They don't quite know what to do with the neck. And this is the classic face that has come down to us through the ages.
And so from that point on, it seems that all the images begin to change.
Yes.
Into this
stylized,
long hair, full beard,
right,
flattened nose, hollow eyes, and you know, we're going to be right back with this in just a minute. So stay tuned to more of the Shroud Report. Hi, I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. And our guest is Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia, and we've been talking about this fascinating trail that you called spy clues, and some of those clues can be found in images, but you've also specialized in finding these clues in the historical literature. Why don't you give us some of those things?
Literature and liturgy.
Liturgy, okay.
Which is the worship of the church. In 325 A.D., Pope Sylvester called a council at the Baths of Trajan in Rome. And at that council they decided that no longer could you celebrate the Mass, the Holy Communion, without having a cloth representing the shroud on the altar. Now today that would be like placing a casket of a revered person on the altar, and you wonder why you would take supposedly a symbol of death and put it there. As we look further in that same century, we come on to a fellow named Theodore of Mopsuestia. And he tells us that in the course of the liturgy, they develop a little ceremony to place that cloth on the altar. Two deacons carry the cloth down the aisle in procession and lay it out upon the altar. But the interesting thing, even more interesting than that, is he also adds the fact that these two deacons represent the figure on the shroud. This is 4th century.
And that's 4th century.
4th century.
So what that says then is that as early as the 4th century, somebody knew that the shroud existed and there was an image on it.
Yeah. Well, we think earlier than that.
Okay.
And I can't imagine it's being saved out of that empty tomb unless there was something highly unusual about it, because it's covered with blood. It covered a condemned criminal, and
to the Jews it would be considered unclean.
The corpse, so it was triply unclean. There had to be something unusual for them to save it. Well, let's jump ahead. Now, we were just in the 4th century. Let's jump ahead to the 7th century in Spain to a liturgy called the Mozarabic Rite. Mozarabic just means these were Spaniards living in Spain at the time of the Muslim occupation. And there we have in this rite a bishop named Leandro, who was a young priest, had been sent to Constantinople along with Gregory from Rome, who became Pope Gregory the Great. They are ambassadors, if you would, within 50 years after the shroud's rediscovery. Leandro comes back and oversees this Mozarabic rite, which is still celebrated daily in Toledo at the cathedral there. In that Mozarabic rite, there is an allatio, which is a fancy word for a preface for Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday. We've always wondered what Peter may have seen in that empty tomb. Luke tells us he went away wondering at what he had seen without specifying it. But in this Mozarabic rite, it says, Peter saw the vestigia, a Latin word that is not precise. It can mean traces, it can mean footsteps and other things, but sometimes even imprint, traces of the dead and newly resurrected man on the shroud.
Now that's from the 7th century.
7th century.
So even here, so we go 4th century, 7th century, we're talking about historical references to an image on this cloth.
Right, and one of the other things that is there's a much debated thing called the Mass of St. Gregory, named after the Pope, the same fellow that we had talked about earlier, who had been the ambassador with Bishop Leandro to Constantinople. And if you look at some of the artwork that represents this Mass, you see a little Christ with the hands crossed, just as they are on the shroud, standing on the altar in the midst of this Mass, supposedly deriving from a vision had by Gregory. So you have two people who were probably, no doubt, made aware of the shroud's existence and what was on it while they were in Constantinople, who returned to their own countries and, in a sense, possibly have incorporated it within the liturgies that they deal with. In the same century, suddenly...
Now, what century is this now?
We're in the 7th century.
7th century, okay.
In the same century, the first coin bearing an image of Christ's face is struck in Byzantium. The first of these coins is a tiny little one about the size of our dime, called a tremesis.
And is that what we have here?
That's what's up on the screen at the